それではお時間になりましたので、始めさせていただきたいと思います。本日はどうもご参集いただきましてありがとうございます。私は環境エネルギー政策研究所田島誠と申します。本日は営農ソーラーの国際的動向と国際協力と題しまして、約2時間にわたり皆様と時間を共にしていただきたいと思います。営農ソーラー、もしくは営農型太陽光発電、ソーラーシェアリングは近年、世界的にも目覚ましい発展を遂げています。もうすでに世界25カ国で、何らかの形で、営農ソーラーが実践されています。そして国際会議も近年急速に数を増していまして、5つを数えるまでになっています。その中の、一番最初ですね、先駆けとなったのが、アグリボルテイクスの国際会議です。2020年から始まりまして、毎年1回周年で、各国持ち回りで開催されています。2020年第1回目はフランス、21年2回目がドイツ、22年の3回目がイタリア、そして今回初めてアジア地区、韓国で開催されました。で、そこに開催された方々、外国のですね、トップクラスの研究者、実践者の方々の約3分の1がですね、今回日本に来ていただいて、過去2日間にわたり日本のソーラーシェアリングを視察していただきました。で、今日の午後から2日間にわたってですね、これまでの成果をもとに、じゃあより良いソーラーシェアリングの発展を目指して、どういった研究協力ができるのか、どういったビジネス面での協力ができるのか、で、制度や政策、こういったものは一体どうしていったらいいのか、そういったことを考えていきたいと思っております。で、今日がその第1回目となります。で、本セミナーは、多くの団体の共催によって成り立っております。ソーラーシェアリング推進連盟、市民エネルギーちば株式会社TERRA、ソーラーシェアリング総合研究所、二本松ご当地エネルギーをみんなで考える会、ご地間ですね。それと全国ご当地エネルギー協会、そして我々の環境エネルギー政策研究所の共催となっています。で、本セミナーは地球環境基金の助成を得て、可能となっております。で、プログラムですが、まず最初の75分間、海外のゲストの方々に、ご講演をいただきます。で、4カ国、5カ国か、5カ国からの話ということで、各代表者の方には10分から15分の時間の発表をお願いしたいと考えております。最初にドイツ、フランス、米国、台湾、そして最後にですね、ドイツで垂直ソーラーというのが非常に盛んになってきて、で、日本でもパイロットプラントを我々も作っているんですが、その実践例についてご講演いただきます。で、それに続いて、本当に時間短いんですが、30分間、これから我々一緒に共同で研究したり、共同研究開発をしたり、共同の事業をやるために一体どうしたらそういうことができるのかということを議論してみたいと思います。それではまず最初にソーラーシェアリング推進連盟の共同代表、西様の方より開会の言葉をいただきます。西さんじゃないか。近藤様ですね。すいません。
私はソーラーシェアリング推進連盟共同代表の近藤圭です。共催団体を代表して挨拶いたします。今日は世界のトップリーダーたちが集う素晴らしい国際セミナーが開催できますことを心より喜んでおります。私たちの狙いは2つです。1つ、農業と太陽光発電が同一の土地で、しかも同時にできることを確認すること。2つ、太陽と土地の奪い合いをいかにやめるか。このことにつきます。この2つの達成は、一部の資本家や一部の農地所有者、一部の開発業者だけの幸せではなく、 普遍的な人類の発展と幸福につながります。韓国から続くハードなスケジュールの中で5名の講師の方にお話しいただきます。ドイツのマックスからは、世界の営農ソーラーの考え方の違い、法律の比較、ガイドラインの比較、フランスのクリスチャンからは、原発も多いフランスでのこれまでの精力的な営農型発電の研究、アメリカの会からは、複数の研究施設、ソーラーシェアリングガーデンからの報告をしていただきます。台湾のチンリアン・リュウさんからは、養殖と水上ソーラーを協業する上での様々な緩和策。最後にドイツのサーシャからは、今回の韓国の国際会議でも多くの紹介があった垂直営農ソーラーの紹介。そして後半は当連盟理事で環境エネルギー政策研究所の田島さんにモデレーターを務めていただきながら国際的な協業も議論します。5名の講師とモデレーターに心より敬意と感謝を申し上げます。事前に皆様の発表資料を拝見させていただいて感じたこと、韓国の国際会議でも言葉の壁がありながらも学び得たことは繰り返しになりますが、太陽と土地の奪い合いをいかにやめるか、極めて論理的に進めていることです。そして前例のないことなので、非常に果敢なチャレンジとブラッシュアップを繰り返しています。私たち日本人もその輪に加わることで相互に有益なことがあります。もちろん経済的な面だけでなく、感情も含めて自分たちの利害に直結しますので、大変複雑な問題ではありますが、それを克服するところに私たちの大きな喜びもあります。最後に、私の敬愛するアフガニスタンの多くの人々を灌漑事業で救った日本人の故中村哲医師の言葉を紹介いたします。ある日の朝礼で水路事業や医療活動をする現場職員の前で語った言葉です。自分の会社の仕事だけではなく、毎日1時間自分の国と人々のために働きなさい。農家は自分の作物のことだけにこだわらず、反対に発電事業者も発電量のことだけにこだわらず、1時間でも1平方メートルでもシェアすれば平和な世界を作れることを信じてやみません。会場の参加者様、オンラインの参加者の登録数は100名にも上っております。その方々にも感謝いたします。録画でこれから聞いてくださる方、未来の参加者にも、最後に準備をしてくれた多くの関係者、スタッフに感謝します。それでは国際セミナーを始めましょ
う。それでは早速プログラムに入らさせていただきたいと思います。トップバッターはドイツフランホーファー太陽エネルギーシステム研究所、フランホーファー以前の営農ソーラーグループの長をしておられますマックス・トロムゾロフ氏です。マックス氏にはドイツの営農ソーラーの現状について話していただきます。それではよろしくお願いいたします。
Thanks for the hint. Thanks, Kondo. Thanks, Makoto. Thanks for everybody who organized this, for being here. It's a big honor for me and also for my colleagues to be here to do this international exchange. As you said, Kondo, the peaceful development of photovoltaics, that's why we are here. Because we see some issues with the development. We know that it's needed to develop photovoltaics, but with solar sharing, we have the opportunity to do this in a peaceful way. And together we would be stronger for sure, to learn from each other and to take this further for upcoming generations. So My name is Max Tromsdorf. I'm heading the group of agrivoltaics in Fraunhofer-ISE. And my first slide is dedicated to Mr. Götzberger, who founded the Fraunhofer-ISE more than 40 years ago. And in the same year of the foundation, he published the idea of agrivoltaics for the very first time and laid the pillar for all the work we are doing at Fraunhofer-ISE since then. What is agrivoltaics? So the question is always not so easy because it's pretty diverse. And if you look at Wikipedia, it's just co-developing the land for two things, agriculture and PV. But the question arises, what is agriculture? And here it starts to get complex because according to a definition of the International Labour Organization, it's agriculture, the science, art and practice of cultivating plants and livestock. But obviously here in the context of agrivoltaics, it's just the cultivation and less the art or science. And the practice of agriculture, that's already indicating which troubles we run if we would like to go for definitions or standards of agrivoltaics. And why do we need such? We know that energy and agriculture are two sectors which are highly regulated. And without a clear understanding what agrivoltaics is, we will have very much difficulties to regulate it, to create a legal framework that enables this dual land use. So I just go on with some pictures which shows the variety of agrivoltaics. It can be high elevated systems over arable farming, could be horticultural applications which protects crops from environmental hazard. It could be also a combination between foil tunnels and PV modules, grassland farming, horticulture, even aquaculture bodies. We will hear later also some presentations from Taiwan, where aquaculture PV is a very rising issue. With animal husbandry, closed systems like PV greenhouses. So to tackle all this variety, we have find ways, terms and definitions to do so. And one general understanding of agrivoltaics comes from the Japanese terminology, which is solar sharing. So having photons split up between both areas. If you can go one slide back maybe to the illustration, exactly. So that's an attempt from us at Fraunhofer-ISE to classify the different applications. And you see on the left-hand side, the open systems, which are usually in the focus. And on the right-hand side, closed systems, PV greenhouses, and also grayed out because it's rather a border application, even indoor farming, for example, with artificial lighting and vertical farming. We will focus on the green boxes, and here we can have ground-mounted interspace systems and overhead agrivoltaic systems, and three main application areas, which are grassland, arable, and horticulture, but also the fourth application, aquaculture PV. So in Germany, we sit together since 2.5 years approximately to think how we can create a common understanding of agrivoltaics. And the first step was to create a standard, which is called DIN spec number 91434. And the main purpose or aim of this standard is to set criteria that assure the primary use of the land is still agriculture. And we know that this is a serious issue, because from an economic point of view, in many applications, the PV production will be the stronger one. And that's why we don't target electrical issues at all, but only focus on how much land can be lost due to the PV installation, how much must be the minimum agricultural yield for an agrivoltaic system, and what other things like light distribution and water distribution has to be considered. It was a process for more than 1 year with 15 partners. And a central body was the German Institute for Normalization, DIN, which provided this standardized process of the DIN spec. And the next pictures will show the two categories, the one for overhead systems, every system above a vertical clearance of 2.10 meters. And for category 2, next slide, every system which is below this benchmark of 2.10 meters. And what was important for us to classify also the 4 different application areas: horticulture, permanent crops, arable with perennials, and 2 classes of grassland, one with haying, one with animal husbandry, in order to provide a basis to differentiate between those different applications. Because when we talk about a definition, we know it's not as easy to draw the line between ground-mounted and agrivoltaic systems. Is sometimes not possible anymore. And sometimes, depending on the legal context, we must shift this red line. So the lessons learned from this process were that in the end, actually, it was a compromise between a lot of parties. It was a long, tiring process. A lot of people from this room here have joined this process. But what was the clear result already after a few months, that it's much better having a bad definition or a weak standard than having no standard at all. Because then you have at least one basis ground for discussions and for taking this further. With the core criteria of 66%, we are much lower than, or let's say 13-14% lower than the Japanese criteria, and also lower than most of the others I will show now. But I think that's also something we would like to learn from each other. How far can we go, and especially how to assure that these standards are kept. And we've seen great systems today, and we are very thankful for Kondo and the other people who showed us. But it also raises a lot of questions. How we report this agricultural yield, how we make a rule which also applies larger investors to investigate the field of agrivoltaics, how to assure a strong commitment of farmers and communities. It was very interesting to see in SOSA, and actually also very touching to see this community ambitions and this strong passion towards this dual land use. But that's not going on its own. So we need also regulations who are incentivizing this kind of business models. I'm gonna leave Germany now and have a look at Italy. Just a year later, in Italy, there was an attempt from some companies to establish a standard which is yet not legal binding. And another attempt just a few months later, which was published then in summer, from 4 institutes, and they were contracted or supported by the Ministry of the Environment and Energy Security in Italy, the MITE, under the lead of Enea. And they published a report which is based on 5 different core requirements in a modular approach to define agrivoltaics. And I will briefly go through these 5 requirements. There's requirement A, which is fixing, for example, the area which is devoted to agricultural activity, which has to be at least 70%. To comparison, in Germany, this is maximum of 15% losses. So here the German standard is stricter, and the curiosity is the maximum land area occupation of the PV panels. This is restricted to 40%, and we have had a lot of discussions if this would somehow prohibit the use of transparent PV modules. And this is not specified until now. But that's an open question, because we know from some applications that semi-transparent PV modules actually are a great opportunity, especially in horticulture applications, to protect crops without losing too much of sunlight for the agriculture layer. Requirement B, there is one also interesting part that here also a minimum electrical yield is required, namely 60% compared to a standard PV ground-mounted system. And that's also, yeah, sensible thing, because usually in PV we would assume that there is a high competition to maintain the economic performance, which would always speak to a higher density of PV. So it's very interesting that in Italy they also took this as a criterion. Requirement C, that's rather an overview about different approaches, like vertical agrivoltaics, overhead agrivoltaics, and interspace agrivoltaics, similar to the classification I've shown before. And the last two requirements, D and E, they rather focus on monitoring, where the first one, requirement D, is a monitoring system that verifies the impact on crop, water saving, and agriculture productivity, while requirement E goes one step further, also allowing the monitoring system to verify soil fertility, microclimate, and also climate change resilience. And as a summary for the Italian guideline, both requirements A and B are required in order to be classified as an agrivoltaic system. All four requirements have to be required to be defined as an advanced agrivoltaic system, but only if all five requirements are fulfilled, then the system is eligible to receive some grants according to the Italian regulation.
Max, you have 2 more minutes.
Yes, I'm almost done, Makoto. Thanks a lot. And this is still open question how this will translate into the legislation. And we are very curious about the next steps. The process is still ongoing. Regarding France, I don't talk a lot because later we have a presentation by Christian. Just mention the base definition by Adem and sharing the link here on the slide, because there's a nice summary available in English language, which is very helpful for us. And I would encourage at this point, if there's some new guidelines come out in a country or also laws, to translate them in English in order to exchange this information. So that was very good in France that we had the summary. I will also jump over the legislation in Japan, because most people here know much better than me about it. And I would also save the last minute. I would have to have a bit more time in the end for the discussions, because that's why we're actually here for, to learn from you, to share our experience, and to connect for a strong collaboration in the future. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Max. Maybe we can take a few questions, but質問ちょっとある方もいるかと思うんですが、ちょっと議論の時間を取りたいと思いますんで、もしどうしてもという方があったら質問を受け付けますが、そうでなれば最後の議論の時間にちょっと回したいと思います。よろしいですか。Okay, thank you, Max. 続いて、フランスの営農ソーラーの現状について、クリスチャン・ドゥプラス博士から発表いただきます。博士は、ヨーロッパ最大の研究所ですね。フランス国立農業食料研究所の、インレイというんですが、そこのアグロフォレストリー及び営農ソーラーの上級研究員をされていらっしゃいます。では、よろしくお願いします。
Thank you, Makoto. You are moving the slides or I do? No, you are doing? He is doing. Okay, thank you. Well, it's a great pleasure to meet you and to share with you what we try to achieve in France about agrivoltaics. I am impressed because you guys in Japan, you were far in advance compared to us. And we didn't know. We didn't know until 2015, I would say. We worked separately, and that's a big pleasure to be together and share what we have done separately up to now. Okay, if we can start with the slides. Thank you. So I will talk you about what happened in the past, in the present, and what may happen in the future in France. So some pictures about systems that are installed in France, maybe compared to what I have seen so far in Japan. In France, we have quite a large number of projects with fruit trees under panels, which is quite something that I haven't seen here so far. But the other kind of systems, you know them. The big difference with what I've seen so far in Japan is that we have big machinery in France. So we need to have systems with large alleys for crop machinery between the posts. Next slide. For us in Europe, we have not much land, and we need to install a lot of PV panels to meet our objectives for the energy transition. And there is a big debate about that in Europe and in France in particular. Where should we put these panels? On roofs, of course, on commercial buildings, on industry buildings, but this will not be enough. And of course, as always, agricultural land is a target. It's a target because it's available, it's easy to monitor, it's usually flat, so it's very attractive for companies. So there is a strong debate about that, and the potential is huge because in France we have 30 million hectares of crop cultivative land. If we only transfer 2% of that into agrivoltaics, we can produce as much electricity as all our 56 nuclear plants. So that's really a huge potential. But there is a lot of debate about that. It's controversial, and a lot of people don't want to see any panel on agricultural crops, on agricultural land, because food is a priority and we need to protect the soil and keep the food production as a priority. So the debate is mostly because we have huge PV projects in France. Some of these projects, like next slide, are on huge areas, like 2,000 hectares. And in this project, they cancel agriculture. The farmers give their rights to crop, and they just have the rent of the land, and they earn more money compared to the previous situation when they were cropping. So this kind of situation is really controversial, and a lot of debate, angry debate is running about that. At the moment, it is forbidden, I will tell you later, it's forbidden to cut forest to put PV panels in France, and it's forbidden to put ground-mounted panels on agricultural land. We have been working on next slide, please. We have been working on agrivoltaics as we were inspired by agroforestry. Agroforestry is my primary competence, skill. I've been working on agroforestry for 30 years, and we decided to try to replace the trees with the panels. So crops and trees or crops and panels are similar things. And at the moment, I am the editor-in-chief of the Agroforestry Systems Journal that is opening its pages to agrivoltaics too. Next slide. So this is the prototype, the first agrivoltaic plant in Europe, I think, and in France. I built that plant in 2010, 13 years ago. The first part was the fixed panels in the middle, and then we added moving panels on the two sides. And in the fixed panels part, you can see that there are half density panels and full density panels. And that was very important to measure the impact of panels on crops. Next slide. That's the first paper where we wrote for the first time agrivoltaics, the word agrivoltaics in 2011. And since then, Next slide. We have been INRAE, my institute that is devoted to agricultural research and environmental research in France. We have collaboration with more than 10 different companies, electricity companies, to work on different systems of agrivoltaics all over France, and you have the names on this picture. Few images now of some projects we are working on. This one is with the Remtech company. It's near Paris. It's about fodder production. You know, it's those mobile trackers run on 2 axes, so they follow fully the sun, and we measure the production and so on. The next one is the vertical panels that we saw this morning, exactly the same, but we have wide alleys so that we can use big machinery, and this is for cow grazing and hay producing. So it's in the mountains, in a different climate, about 1,000 meter elevation. The next example is solar cloth. It's a different system. It's a textile. It's a soft and supple cover, PV cover that can be used in many situations. For example, in glass houses to provide shade and electricity at the same time. Another example is the program I'm working on for the last 12 years with the Sonagri company. And in this example, the panels are mobile on 1 axis. And so we can provide shade or sun to the crop when we want, when the crop wants. So we are preparing algorithm to improve, to optimize the crop growth by providing light when the crops needs light and providing shade when the crops needs shade. This system is very important because in Europe and in France in particular, agro-PV, agrivoltaics is really designed to protect crops against climate change because we have too much sun radiation, we have very heat, we have drought, and we need to protect the crops, especially in the south of France. Next slide. Yes, I need to go back to my slide because it's not so. One very specific aspect is that we grow a lot of fruit trees in France, and these fruit trees are very endangered because of climate change. We have a lot of frost, late frost on early developed trees that kill the flowers, for example, and the panels can be used to limit frost under the panels. We have a lot of heating season when it's flowering or when the fruits are growing that can destroy the fruits. So we use the panels for that. We have a lot of vineyards that are also endangered because of the climate change. The grapes are too rich in sugar and not enough acid. So we put shade on the vineyards to increase the quality of the grapes. So this is an example by a farmer of a commercial installation that has been opened last month. So we have a number of them at the moment in France. Next one. A lot also about glass houses. So we have been making solar glass houses like the one on the top left where nothing can grow because it's too dark. The ground coverage ratio of those kind of glass houses is 50% or even more, and you have not enough light to do any commercial growth in these glass houses. So we are doing new kind of glass houses with mobile panels, like you see on the other images, and those ones are much more efficient. So now I go to the debate. There is a strong debate on how to regulate agrivoltaics in France. I've seen that in Japan, you use the 80% limit requirement for the crop yield under the system. We may have another approach in France. This is a tentative synthesis about the impact of the ground coverage ratio, the area of panels per hectare that you have in your system, and the relative yield, which is the yield under the panels to the yield in the full sun situation. And it seems that there is a good correlation, at least for annual crops. For perennial crops, for fruit trees, for vineyards, it's a different story. But for annual crops, the relationship seems quite clear. You need to limit the ground coverage ratio of your system to be a true agrivoltaic system. So I've seen that in Italy, they decided that the limit would be 40% of ground coverage ratio. My advice is only 25%. But it's very difficult to convince electric companies to go down to that level. Of course, they have their business plan, but that would be my guess. And in France, it's not decided yet. We have a new law. I will talk you in a few minutes, but the decree of application of that law may precise that aspect later. Next slide. So in France, we have an association, France Agrivoltaïsme, which where most of the players in agrivoltaïsme are members. So we have one voice, one strong voice to defend agrivoltaïsme in the parliament, to help the development of agrivoltaïsme, and that's very important. We also have a label that allows to certificate that projects are agrivoltaics. And this label is new. It has been used for some projects, but it's very useful to help to control what's going on. Finally, the final lessons that we have from France is, okay, we won't have 1 million hectares of agrivoltaics. That would be too much electricity for France. So we will have maybe someday 100,000 hectares of agrivoltaics. So how should we share those 100,000 hectares between farmers, between provinces of France? It's a limited area that will be installed as agrivoltaics in the future. And there are two options. Either you allow huge projects, 100 hectares, 200 hectares, 1,000 hectares. We have companies that want to do 1,000 hectares projects, or you do small projects, 1 hectare, half an hectare. And in the two cases, you will have very few farmers that are involved, or many, many farmers that are involved. So that's a political question that we are addressing at the moment. And I am in favor of small projects, but nobody agrees. There are discussions about that. That's it. And very important point is that we want to limit the land, the price for the companies to install PV on cropland. If they pay a lot of money to the farmer has no need to do any crop cultivation. So that's very important. And if they pay a lot of money to the farmer, there will be speculation. I don't know if the word is correct. There will be land speculation, and people will not want to rent their cropland to farmers, expecting for higher income from agrivoltaics. So that's really a problem that we have. Well, that's it for this presentation. I have some few slides about the regulation in France. Do I have time for that? Yeah, okay.
About 1 minute.
1 minute, okay. So that's a joke. I don't know if it's translated, if you understand that, but an electrical field is something that may be dangerous. Next slide, please. No, you don't have it? There is no slides? It's the last one, so the next presentation was not included? Okay, I can tell you some few words about regulation in France without the slides. At the moment, we have about 100 projects, 100 agrivoltaics projects in France, and for a total of about 300 hectares. So that's not much. It's just the beginning of the system. But the French Parliament has voted a law very recently, 1 month ago, to foster the development of agrivoltaism, and it has included a definition of agrivoltaism in the law. And that definition is that agrivoltaism is a tool to protect the crops. So crops are first. Agrivoltaics is there to produce electricity, but first to protect the crops. And the yield of the crop should not decrease. So which is a very difficult target for us. The yield of the crop should not decrease. And that's, and the definition includes, that's it? Okay. So I don't know what, which one it is, but that's it. Anyway, I'll talk to you about that. So in France, if you build an agrivoltaic plant, you need a permit for constructing it. The permit is quite difficult to obtain because you have an impact assessment on the environment. You have a public inquiry. Every neighbors can say his word about the project. And then you have a validation by the French Environmental Authority. So it's a difficult process, and it takes up to 3 or 4 years to get the permit at the moment. And the new law is there to accelerate the process, to make things faster and to simplify some aspects. I'm not sure it will be successful, but that's the idea. So at the moment, agrivoltaics is a project where you put panels on cropland, but these panels should improve the conditions for the crop. Not worsen the conditions, but improve the conditions for the crops. So protect the crops against heat, against frost, against hail, and so and so. And it should also protect the animals because we have a lot of animals. So it should always be positive towards the crops or the animals. So agricultural production is a priority. So that's the most important point. It will be controlled by local authorities. That's very important. So you need the approval of the mayor of the place. You need the approval of a commission where you have all farmers, state, NGOs, environmental NGOs. They are all members in the commission and should give the green light for your project to be installed. So that's quite a difficult process. Maybe next slide or the next one. Yeah, so sorry, but this is very important. No, previous one, sorry, with the pictures. Yeah. A very important aspect is that when you install an agrivoltaic system in France, you may apply to a tender by the national authority to get a feed-in tariff. And this tender, now agrivoltaics is in the same call as the parking voltaics, you know, because it's an elevated system and the level cost of energy is similar in the two systems. So they have been included in the same call, which are elevated systems. And if you are successful, you get a feed-in tariff that is quite, well, at the moment, it's not that much attractive, but it's better than if you don't have it. So that's a very important decision that was taken. And final, yeah, next one. Next one, that's the law. And that's my final slide. It's about Japan and France. What could we learn from each other? So for Japan, I've talked about the 80% yield limit that you need to achieve. In France, it's even 100%, which will be quite difficult. But there are still shadows in the system. We will see how it comes out. So the French label, AFNOR label, will help to sort out good and poor projects. We are discussing if we need a maximum limit in the ground coverage ratio of the system. So the Italians said 40%. I would rather push for 30%. There is a very important point. In France, when you install an agrivoltaic system, land is still agricultural. It doesn't change. So that's very, very important. And it means that farmers still get the common agricultural policy subsidies for their crops on the plot. So that's a very important aspect. And of course, we need to have social acceptance of the system. And there is a lot of discussion about that in France. I am finished. Thank you very much.
クリスチャン、どうもありがとうございます。あまりここでカバーする予定なかったんですが、ということで、そこまで話していただきました。明日ですね、東京でまたセミナーが何回かあるんですが、そこで制度面については深い議論をしていきたいと思っております。それに向けた非常にいい頭出しを、マックスもしてくださいましたし、それからクリスチャンの他もあったと思います。いろいろ言いたいことあるんですが、そこは明日に譲って、次のプレゼンターの方に知らさせていただきたいと思います。続いてはですね、米国の営農ソーラーの現状について、アリゾナ大学のカイ・リプレイ氏からプレゼンテーションをいただきます。よろしくお願いします。
Hello, everyone. I'd like to start by saying thank you, Makoto. Thank you so much for organizing this wonderful event. It's incredible to be here with so many of you from around the world in Japan, where we've seen dramatic agrivoltaics development and we're learning so much. I'd like to talk to you all about agrivoltaics in the United States, which you'll see it's very different than a lot of our colleagues around the world. Our policy is still very new, and the agrivoltaic landscape in the United States is far less developed than in Japan, France, or Germany, for instance. But we also have very different climate, for instance, in Arizona, where you can introduce 100% shade from solar panels and still grow crops just fine. Sorry, Christian. So, next slide. First, I'll talk to you about trends in photovoltaic energy in the United States, which I think sets the landscape for agrivoltaics. And we'll move into photovoltaic development on the ground, the agrivoltaic landscape, and a few case studies of the existing agrivoltaic systems in the US. Next slide. So this graph here shows the amount of new electrical generating capacity added in the US over approximately 20 years. And you can see this dramatic shift from primarily natural gas being added to solar energy taking up a significant portion of the new electrical generating capacity added. Now, in the next graph, we see that reflected again. And by last year, we saw photovoltaic solar energy accounting for nearly half of the new electrical generating capacity that we've added in the United States. And on this final graph, we see that in every projection of the energy mix for the United States, solar energy is playing a dominant role. We know there's going to be more photovoltaic energy, and it's going to need to be addressed if we want to integrate it into our landscapes sustainably and peacefully. Next slide. So it's curious that we only need to develop half of 1% of the land in the United States to meet our 2050 solar energy needs. But as you see, around 50%, half of the land in the US is agriculture already. And you see this is concentrated in the center of the nation, but distributed widely. And it tends to happen that the places where agriculture exists also are the best places to put photovoltaic energy. and that might be similar in many of our countries. I also put Japan, a small picture of Japan over the United States for a comparison of scale, thinking about how different our challenges are in the US and how we think about agrivoltaics in a different way. Next slide, please. So agrivoltaic energy is most likely to be developed on agricultural land because of these features that we're familiar with. It's flat, it meets the same requirements, it's close to the transmission lines that we need to connect to our infrastructure and grids in many cases. And this bottom map actually shows the solar potential across the United States. And you can see, especially in the South and Southwest, that is the primary place where we would see PV development because of the high solar radiation. Next slide, please. Now, around 75% of new solar energy development is happening in this South and Southwest region. And the majority of this development is utility scale, if you look at this figure in the bottom left. But commercial and residential installation do play a large role. So one aspect of the way we're thinking about agrivoltaics is these large-scale installations. We have solar being installed at a rapid pace, utility scale, megawatt scale solar, and if we ignore that existing PV and ignore those large-scale developments, we're missing a crucial aspect of the agrivoltaic sector in the US. Next slide, please. So if you look at this map on the bottom right and compare it to the map in the top right showing the distribution of agriculture, you can see, it might be hard to see here, but the yellow dots represent solar energy development. And a lot of these large existing developments occur in the same place where we have agriculture already, the Midwest, the Northeast. There are many large developments, and these have played a fundamental role in the existing agrivoltaics in the United States. But solar developers have been very resistant to the idea of integrating other activities alongside photovoltaics. They're concerned about safety risks, damage to the PV systems, and losses in energy production for a number of factors. And this has been one point of contention beside the contention around into PV replacing farmland. Next slide, please. Now, the National Renewable Energy Lab is our central federal organization that studies renewable energy, and they've played a central role in developing agrivoltaics in the US. You can see here an example of their bifacial research garden at their campus in Colorado. And this map on the bottom right is a new map that they also presented at the conference in Korea. And what you see, and you can visit the website and interact with this map, but the majority of these 300 plus agrivoltaic sites in the US are pollinator gardens and grazing. So that means we've taken existing photovoltaic installations, sometimes at scale, and planted them with native pollinator crops to create habitat, or graze them with sheep or other animals, primarily sheep. But that accounts for the majority of the systems in the US today. And there are very few systems that focus on specialty crops or field crops or other types of agriculture. And those other types are distributed around the rest of the nation. Next slide, please. And so one of the primary things that we're thinking about as we move through this agrivoltaics transition in the United States is the difference between PV-centric agrivoltaics, as you see on those top three installations, where you have energy production from photovoltaics as the primary land use, and agriculture such as pollinator gardens or grazing as a secondary land use, in contrast to a lot of the talk we've been hearing about agrivoltaics today. Now on the bottom, you have an ag-centric, an agricultural-centric approach to agrivoltaics, where you're thinking about agriculture first, and the PV energy is an addition to that. And this is where we think about having different types of grazing, potentially greenhouses, specialty crops, and field crops. But one concern is, will we see agrivoltaics in the US take only a PV-centric approach or shift more towards an ag-centric approach? We don't have policy existing right now that guides us in either direction. We don't have yield requirements that would ensure there is an ag-centric approach. But the question remains, do we need that type of policy, or is it important to develop agrivoltaics at the large scale or potentially adapt our existing utility scale photovoltaics? Next slide, please. Now, this map by NREL shows a network of primary agrivoltaics research sites around the nation, and this represents a more diverse picture of agrivoltaics, including pollinator gardens, grazing, specialty crops, field crops, the whole system throughout the country in a concerted effort to understand agrivoltaics across this diverse climate and region. Next slide, please. So just to give an example of a couple of these sites, this is the Biosphere 2 Research Center in Arizona, where our team does a lot of our research and has for the last 7 years. You can see on the bottom part near the big dome, that's our agrivoltaic research center, and it's an experimental plot. Now, for the last 7 years, that has been 100% shade, and we have grown crops, or nearly 100% shade, because in order to get the funding to study agrivoltaics from the Department of Energy, they wanted to see if you have maximum photovoltaic energy production, can you still grow crops beneath it? It was very much guided by a PV-centric approach. But what we found is that in the harsh conditions of Arizona, where the temperatures in the summer can be above 45 degrees Celsius, and there's very little rainfall, we actually see incredible benefits from the shade. Water conservation, the crops actually perform better because they don't experience the stress from heat and too much sunlight. So we have to think about agrivoltaics in a completely different way here. We have studied a wide variety of specialty crops at this site, and you can see this list including potatoes, carrots, tomatoes, peppers, herbs, flowers, onions, squash, just about every specialty crop that we can think of. We decided to see, despite our harsh environment where these crops might not grow well in the sun, how would they do in the shade of agrivoltaics? And we found a number of, next slide, please. We found a number of interesting results in this high density solar environment. Now, when we irrigate our crops in the full sun, we find that we have to water them every day in the summer to keep them alive. But in the shade of the panels, we might only need to irrigate once a week. And in Arizona, where water is such a stark issue, this is very important to have those water savings. Farmers are experiencing cuts as we speak across the Southwest. And the savings in water that agrivoltaics and this very dense agrivoltaics provides can mean the difference between farming and not farming. We study the photosynthesis of plants, and if you've seen some of Greg's work, Greg Barron Gafford, you know that the shade can actually alleviate the midday depression that we see where plants begin shutting down photosynthesis as the day heats up, and by noon, your plants in the sun are not producing any growth or any yield while the plants in the shade continue to thrive. We've studied the effects of cooling on the solar panels themselves. And it was interesting to see the thin solar panels used here in Japan, which might have a better capacity to reduce heat. And in Arizona, as the panels heat up, we have a loss in efficiency that the plants can actually alleviate through evapotranspiration. And it could be interesting indeed to study how thinner panels and spacing might also increase this benefit and productivity. One of the final pieces that we're studying at this field site is precision agrivoltaics. So how might we use precision irrigation to deliver water only when the plants need it and maximize the water saving capacity in these systems where water is such an issue, using cameras, thermal imagery to estimate plant growth, water stress, plant health, and maybe even respond in real time to these needs through our farm management practices. And I think agrivoltaics is a really exciting place to integrate the idea of precision agriculture with solar energy generation, because you have these two technologies and they can come together really well. Next slide, please. Let's see, so you can skip again, please. Next, I'd like to talk about Jack's Solar Garden in Colorado, which is one of our other primary research sites. So this is a 1.2 megawatt agrivoltaic farm using single axis tracking panels. And here we grow specialty crops, native grasses for forage, pollinator habitat, and study the yields, water distributions, and next slide, please. Many of the same factors that we're studying in Arizona, where we have different conditions. So one important part of this network that you still see on the top right here is the variety of climatic conditions around the US and thinking about how agrivoltaic systems might differ. For instance, here we chose a wider spacing to accommodate tractors, but also to accommodate increased light for crops, because Colorado is northern in latitude and the benefits might not be the same as in the south, where that shade can play such an important role. What we're finding here is that, if you've seen Greg's talk, you've noticed that there's differences across the beds in this agrivoltaic system, differential patterns of rainfall, moisture, and crops in different beds across these rows are experiencing the benefits differentially. Jack's Solar Garden has also played an instrumental role in education and outreach, the events we've hosted, and creating an education center for agrivoltaics in the center of the country. And one goal here is to bring people into direct contact with agrivoltaics, much like we have seen over the last 2 days, where being right next to the system, seeing the effects in person, can actually change the way we think about it from a farmer's perspective, from a solar developer's perspective, or from someone who's completely new to the idea of agrivoltaics. Next slide, please. Next slide. So we know that agrivoltaics is going to play an essential role in the American energy mix, and it's being taken seriously by stakeholders throughout the country. We just in March had the first agrivoltaics conference in the United States, the Solar Farm Summit, with nearly 500 attendees from around the country, from diverse stakeholder groups, including developers, farmers, and researchers. And we saw that there's interest, there's federal support, and we need to think about how we can make a framework that enables agrivoltaics to develop in a way that's beneficial to all of these stakeholders. We have this remaining question of a PV-centric approach and an ag-centric approach, and how these two different approaches to agrivoltaics need to be integrated into a legal framework, for instance, and into practice. But agrivoltaics research is being taken seriously, it's being funded, and we have some new sites coming online to look at agrivoltaics at all these different scales and different approaches. So we showed you this Biosphere 2 site, which is a test pilot, Jack's Solar Garden, which is a real farm at scale. We're developing a new farm that takes into account the machinery used across the country, and we'll have a site in Arizona, Colorado, and Illinois with 15-meter spacing between tracking arrays to allow machinery to move through and study the potential benefits and potential downsides of agrivoltaics at scale. And one of our newest sites will be looking at 1,000 megawatt photovoltaic installation and adapting agrivoltaics practices to a large utility scale installation, growing specialty crops, native pollinator crops, grasses for forage, and testing a variety of restoration techniques to see if you have photovoltaics that has changed the landscape, how can we integrate agriculture back into that landscape potentially, or remediate the ground beneath? Next slide, please. So that's what I have for now, and I'm very grateful for your attention, and I look forward to the future collaborations we can have about guiding policy and exchanging and learning from Japan, Germany, France, and others around the world who have made all of these strides and advances while considering the unique position of the US, our different climate, and the challenges that we face. Thank you.
ありがとうかい。時間を5分もオーバーしてましたが、各ですね、海外からわざわざ来ていただいたので、十分に話していただきたいと思います。ですね、あと2人、プレゼンターおります。いらっしゃいます。台湾。次が台湾の営農空の現状ということで、台湾非常に東アジアのユニークなケースで、陸上の営農太陽光ソーラーですね。これが基本的に禁止されているんですね。その理由もいろいろ議論の的なんですけれども、そのせいもあって、水上ソーラー、養殖ソーラーが非常に発展していらっしゃいます。その現状について、陳リアン・リュウ博士の方からご報告いただきます。
Thank you, everyone. My name is Liu Zhiliang, and it's happy to be here today. And it's my honor to share about the development of the aquavoltaics in Taiwan. Please, next page. It's all the same situation on me.
Excuse me, can you speak into the mic a little bit?
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me now? Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here today. Maybe I hold it. Hi. Okay. Better now. Thank you, everyone. It's happy to be here today. And it's an honor to share about the mitigation, the development, wrong topic, sorry. The development in aquavoltaic in Taiwan. So next page, please. All right. So here's online, please refer. And next page. So let me next page. So our department is as an energy policy think tank for Bureau of Energy in Taiwan. And our major work is about the photovoltaics white paper, renewable energy policy, and environmental and social inspection for aquavoltaics. The yellow guy in the page is our mascot. His name is Dan. And next page, please. So next, I will dive into the energy in Taiwan. Taiwan is the energy strongly relies on import. More than 97% of energy is imported. And the electricity system is based on thermal power plant. But in recent years, Taiwan's renewable energy is growing rapidly, and most come from the PV power. Next page, please. So our government aims 20% renewable energy by 2025. So to reach this goal, we need solar power, mostly 20 gigawatt. And by the end of the 2022, the total installed capacity of the renewable energy is reached to 14 gigawatt. Next page, please. So to achieve the 20 gigawatt target, we plan about 8 gigawatt from rooftop type PV system and about 12 gigawatt from the ground-mounted solar system. But given the limited availability of the land use and the space for the ground-mounted PV, the principle of the promoting ground PV is to add value to the land use and reduce the reduce the negative social and environmental impact. Next page, please. So why aquavoltaics? Because aquaculture farms are ideal for the solar energy because they have a large area and with the little shading and interference. And PV facilities can also provide like wind shading and benefit in winter and shade in the summer. So the shading rate and the EO limit were determined based on an experiment conducted by Taiwan's Fishery Department. Experiments were conducted on 10 major important aquaculture species, including clam, milkfish, white leg shrimp, etc. As a shading rate of 14%, the yield can reach 17% of the control group. Next page, please. So there are still some challenges when promoting ground-mounted PV in Taiwan. The first, according to the current law, there are only the PV project on the protect wetland and more than 2,000 kilowatt need environmental impact assessment. So without this EIA on this PV project, the public and the NGOs are concerned about may do harms to this, including environmental and cultural landscape and ecosystem provided by fish farms. Next page, please. So our goal is create a rapidly screening procedure to find suitable areas for aquavoltaics and to guide the PV developers to plan appropriate measures to address the local issues. Next page, please. Okay, so we designed an environmental and social inspection process. This process with two stages. First is identifying the issue. Second is proposing the mitigation measures. So in the first stage, the issue is identified, and the fish ponds land will classify into the priority zone, fast track zone, attention zone, and no-go zone. And the second stage, the developer must following the zoning result to propose the mitigation measures plan to get a license and to sell the electricity. Next page, please. So the developers can use the WebGIS system to check the zoning result on the web, on the internet, and they must propose the avoidance reduction, mitigation, and compensation measures at all project stage. And take for example, in the design and planning stage, the developer must do communication and information open, and they must confirm the issue within the site. And in the construction stage, they must propose the plan to reduce the environmental impact, and must do communicate with the local, like fish farmers or residents. And in the operating and commission stage, they must propose the environmental monitor plan and do promise to restoring the land after decommissions. Next page, please. So there are 3 types of visionary and PV integrated system in Taiwan. First is the PV system in ponds. Second is the floating PV. Third is PV system on dikes. So currently the environmental and social inspection is only for the ground-mounted PV right now. Next page, please. So currently, with more than 2,000 hectares of potential aquavoltaics area have passed through the environmental and social inspection, more and more developers are submitting like environmental and social friendly measure checklist or mitigation measure. Mitigation measures plan. So by the end of the March 2023, there are total 29 cases applied to the government, and with the capacity of the 848 megawatt. Next page, please. So next, I will introduce these mitigation measures proposed by these developers. First, as I mentioned before, all stages require the developers to communicate with the local. So the communication with local and do information open is very important. So the developer must, through the in-depth interviews with the fish farmers and landowner, with they discussing the PV layout and make consent is important. And second, the developer most can ask invite landowners, fish farmers, village head, neighborhood, etc., to participate in the public briefing, and they can discuss about and announce about the construction schedule, construction route, future operation plan, and emergency contact window to eliminate the information gap for the fish farmers. Next stage, please. So by the PV design, the fish environment can be improved. The developer, just for example, through the drainage trench, the cleaning water of the PV panel won't flow into the fish pools directly. So the water quality, like pH value, won't be affected when cleaning or during the heavy rain. Or increase the height and spacing in the PV panel and will allow the fishing work to proceed smoothly. And through the PV tarpaulin, adjustable winter-proof PV tarpaulin can avoid damage from the core. Next page, please. So, taking the can farming as an example, the separate management of the clam ponds and the purification pools can improve the fishing environment. PV panels can be installed in the purification pool, and the fish that not were affected by the sun can be selected, like especially sabra, or which can remove invasive shells and mussels and increase the yield. And the metabolic products can be used as nutrition salt into the fishing pools and overflow into the clam ponds and through the connecting pipes to stabilize the growth of the microalgae. Next page, please. And the PV developers also can conduct environmental and ecological survey to understand the issues within its site. And they can adjust the PV layout to address these issues. Take, for example, if there's a bird issue in the within the site. To address this issue, they can use the floating PV to reduce the vision interference for the birds, and or they can widen the dike to make the bird to use. They can also set up artificial floating islands to let the bird to inhabit and to use. Next page, please. So when the fish harvest is complete, the pond is drained for drying. The water level in the pond decreased after attracting a large number of birds to feed. For the birds, it's like an all-you-can-eat restaurant. So as an eco-friendly measures, extending the time of the low water level would allow more birds to use the fish ponds. Next page, please. So final, in the operation and decommission stage, the developer must submit an ecological monitoring plan for the projects. The water quality items is common. Other items may include like bird, bat, plant, and well, depending on the issue within the site. And all monitoring items requires establishing a baseline before this construction, and the monitoring data must open to the public. Next page, please. So in conclusion, the environmental and social inspection provide a clear direction for the solar industries to design mitigation measures to tackle the ecological and social impact. Among 43,000 hectare fish pond in Taiwan, more than 20,000 designated areas have been reviewed and announced. So by the end of the March 2023, a total of the 848 megawatt project in Southwest Taiwan are submit mitigation measures. And thank you for your attention. I hope this information was helpful. Thank you.
劉博士ありがとうございました。劉博士は台湾工業技術研究院、イトリーですね、の準研究をされていらっしゃいます。続きまして、最後の発表になりますが、福島でもですね、東方で、去年ですね、初めて導入した垂直ソーラー。これに関して、開発元であるネクス通産の出向役員、サーシャ・クラウセ・タンカー氏よりご報告いただきます。この垂直ソーラーも含めて、今現在世界中で様々な形態、様々な目的の営農ソーラーっていうのが発達しています。その一つの事例としてですね、目的及びニーズに合わせたいろんな使い方があるんだということで、ちょっと聞いていただきたいと思います。では、サーシャ、お願いします。
Yeah. First of all, thanks a lot, Makoto, for the introduction and the invitation here, and also the organization of this really very interesting tour. We see a lot during the last 2 days over here, and my special thanks also for establishing the first vertical bifacial plant in Japan. That's my topic I want to introduce to you. So we now start with the presentation. Here we see a picture from one of our plants in Germany, Donaueschingen. Next to Sun is the inventor and technology leader in this field. We developed this vertical bifacial system. And we see that it, of course, leaves a lot of space for agricultural use, simply due to the fact that it's vertical and only needs very rare space. So let's go to the next slide. I want to give you a short overview how we look at agrivoltaics. We see three, let's say, variants in the base. On the one hand, we have 2 levels. That's, I think, the most common one, or the best well-known one. We see we are one level with PV, and below we have the level for the agricultural ground. We see our system and very different, since it doesn't use different levels but different dimensions. We take the vertical dimension for the PV production, and we left the horizontal production, the horizontal space for the agriculture. This is the result, is that we only keep around 1% of the ground for such a system. And third, which need to be discussed if it is agrivoltaics or not, is a simple side-by-side approach where we have some, however, built modules beside agricultural ground, which can be used side by side. Next slide, please. This one, to be honest, was only by chance in this presentation, but it's not that bad at this point, since the CEE in Italian has developed also a standard, and they also answered this question, and they said, okay, all three what we have seen is agrivoltaics in a way, or might be agrivoltaics, but they also split up in agrivoltaics and advanced agrivoltaics, and they decided advanced agrivoltaics is only the high level one or the vertical one. Okay, so I think I go on to the next slide. This is, I think, quite easy how it looks like. Here we have these vertical installations. We have a lot of space in between. We need this a lot of space also from the PV side due to shading reasons. But this gives us the degree of freedom we need for real agricultural use. So next slide. Here we again have the figure I already mentioned. Around 1% of the ground is covered. The change in solar irradiation depends highly on where it is installed. In Germany, it's around 10 to 15%, which is kept by the modules. And around 80%, 90% of the ground can still be used for agriculture. If we move on, next slide. We see a huge variety of crops which are possible. I would always say only we can take it the other way around. There are some crops which does not work with such a system, and simply due to their height. If we are talking about corn, for example, going up to 4 meters, it doesn't make sense with a vertical system, since the crops are higher than the panels will be. So sunflowers might also be a problem, but everything else nearly can be made with it. And there I want to show you some impressions on. Okay, I saw it stop. So I think we can go on to the next slide already. Now I want to show you some pictures from some installations we already have in different parts of the world. Left-hand side we already saw. This is a pasture plant in Germany, Donaueschingen, 4 megawatt, which is used for hay and silage production. Right, we see a picture from France from our colleagues of Total Energies, who established a plant for this time, I think it's wheat. And what we see, I think, which is most important, we see that really big harvesters can be used in these parks. We have, I think this one is with a row spacing of 13 meters, and we see a harvester passing by with 12 meters. So that works. Next slide. Some more impressions from Donaueschingen. I think this is, we already have seen. Next slide. again from, okay, no, that's not France. This is also a part of Donau-Eschingen, where we, in this case, produced pea last year. This year, I think we are growing wheat currently. And yeah, also here we see, I think, two effects. On the one hand, we have this huge machinery inside of the panels. On the other hand, what we see here as very good, I think, is also the stripes directly next to the modules. Yeah, since this one can be used for some ecological enhancement. Yeah, we have these grass stripes on both sides, and the possibility to establish some sort of PV hedges, which can also develop a little bit the flora and fauna diversity, which is an additional advantage of such an installation. Next slide. This again is France, lentil production, where we also have some experience with, and yeah, which works quite well. Next slide. Also some impressions. This is Austria. Here, for example, they harvested barley and potatoes, I think. Next slide. This indeed is one in here in Japan, and yeah, we are quite happy to see this here. Next slide. Here, a little bit different application of our system, which is used for fencing. Yeah, we see, for example, in this case, for chicken on the left-hand side, this was the very first vertical solar fence we established on agricultural ground. The right-hand side is in Ireland. There, we also use this fence for cows, and yeah, we now established it also in yeah, around houses in residential areas for energy production. So if we move on to the next slide, we see some data, which I think is also quite important, from one of our plants in 2020. That was a very, very dry year in that region. And there we saw a much better crop performance inside the field than outside. So this is, we already measured a year later. There the effect was not really there, since it was a drier year. It was more rainy. But in the real dry years, we have, of course, the advantage of partial shading. But we have also, of course, the effect of lowering the wind speed, and both helps to keep the land, to keep water in the land, and which helps the crop growing. So next slide. We already mentioned this topic with the additional ecological upgrading. I think we can skip that and move on to the next one. I would also skip that, but the next one I think is important. This is, of course, one of the first, it's always the first question from the guys from the energy side. What about the energy production? Does it make sense? And what we see here is an article from 2013, and the simple answer is yes. What we see is that, especially in the dark parts, they found out that the energy production is even higher than with a conventional south-oriented one. But we need to say there are also some additional facts which could influence that. So, for example, for Japan, whenever you have a lot of snow, this is really good for this type of systems. On the one hand, you do not need to clean the albedo goes up, yeah, and we have the best production by far. We see, for example, or we saw already in February, when the temperature is low, module efficiency is high, the ground albedo is 0.8 instead of 0.2, then this performs really, really brilliant. Yeah? So that's, I think, an important aspect. Move on to the next slide, which is also, I think, quite important, is that we simply widen with this system the availability of PV production. Yeah, we have instead of one peak production at noon, we have normally two peaks in the morning and evening hours, only some a smaller production of 20-25% at noon when all the others produce. Yeah, and I think this is a quite important aspect. On the one hand, from the electricity market, since in Germany we already see that the prices go down and even negative at noon in summertime when all the conventional PV 60 gigawatts so far are burning. And while we see much better prices in the morning and evening hours, and this is of course also for economics a quite important aspect. And also for the energy transition itself. Yeah, we can widen the availability with such a system of electricity production from PV, which means we need less storage and to provide 100% of renewable energy. A second aspect, we can move on to the next slide, is also a question of grid, of course. Since here, I think here we can see it quite well, these market topics, and also the production we see in summertime in Germany. Yeah, with this yellow one, that's solar production and the problem we already have. Yeah? And this is, of course, also a challenge for the grid. And what we can see is if we have a lot of conventional PV in the grid, we can add up to 3 times more capacity of vertical bifacial in the same, let's say, rest amount available in grid capacity compared to another conventional one, since it produces the energy at other times. And I think this is a quite important fact. That's it from my side. I'm looking forward to the further discussion, and thanks a lot for your patience and interest.
Thank you, sir. サーシャ、どうもありがとう。これで、第1部の講演の部を終わりたいと思います。ですね、もうあと20分しかないんですけれども、せっかくの機会なので、この機会にご講演者の方と、それから参加者の方ですね、海外の参加者の方でもですね、非常にいろんな考え、多様な考えがあって、非常にいい意見があって、過去1週間ばかりみんなと議論してきてるんですけど、その全部をカバーすることはできませんが、頭出しの議論をちょっとしたいと思います。我々が一緒にですね、今後共同研究したいとか、共同で事業をしていくということは、何ができるのか、なぜそうした方がいいのかということをちょっと考えてみたいと思います。それではちょっとご講演者の方、前に出てきてください。Max、それから Christian、everybody come up to the stage here. We have only 20 minutes, but we have tons of things we want to discuss. I'd like to concentrate on research, development, and particularly what we can do together, why you think they are so important. Yeah, Max? Oh, right. Okay. Only 20 minutes. ですね、ここにいらっしゃる方々は、国際的にも、それから国内で非常にいろんな研究とか、実地の技術開発ということを、それから法制度の開発とか、政府に対して、 いろんな企画作りとかそういうことに精力的に関わっている方々です。で制度とか政策についてはですね、東京の部でやりたいと思うので、今日は実際に技術開発をしたりとか、実際にこの、ソーラーシェアリングを広めていくために今後どういったことをできるのか、で我々共同してどういったことをしていけるのかみたいなことをちょっと話してみたいと思います。最初にマックスなんですけど、僕ら、ドイツと日本と中国、これで共同研究しようという話が2年ぐらい前からありまして、いろいろ話してきていて、まだ実現していないんですけれども、なぜそういった共同研究ちょっとしようと思ったのか、でそういったことがどういうふうに今後生かされると思って、提案してきたのか、そこら辺のことをちょっと聞かせていただきたいと思います。
Thanks, dear Makoto. I think there are a lot of possibilities out there. And one opportunity is just having a joint project. And the idea of this project, I just mentioned this here briefly, was to catch up in this knowledge gap that we do have. We know there are a lot of systems in Asia, particularly Japan, China, also Taiwan, but we know so little about it. And if you compare how much is researched in Germany with our just 17 facilities, and how much is researched in Japan with this more than 3,000 systems, then we see that it's a large disbalance. So the idea of this project was actually to jointly look at the facilities, to talk to farmers and communities, what are the experiences, what were the agricultural results, the electrical results, the economic performance, and so on, to sit together, to learn from each other, and to transport all this information to these countries which are really in urge to know about this experience. So many countries are just about to start their policies and to create a framework for agrivoltaics, but they know so little. And a lot of our studies done in France, Germany, also US, are actually based not on real systems, but rather on desktop studies, because there are so few systems around. So I think only this small part could be pushing the topic much further.
非常にちょっとマイルドな言葉でおっしゃってましたけど、平たく言うと日本は国際的な発信能力が非常に低くてですね、なかなか日本でやってることとか、東アジア全般そうなんですけども、中国もすごく営農型ソーラー進んでるんですね。ただそういった情報が流れていかない。でもそういったことが明日を作っていくために非常に重要で、みんなで情報をシェアしたり、そういったことをすることが必要じゃないかということで、まずは営農ソーラーの設置が進んでいる日本と中国で、そういった研究を一生懸命しているようなドイツを一緒に情報発信のプラットフォーム研究をしていきたいというようにおっしゃってました。ちょっとクリスチャンに聞きたいんですけど、非常に僕の目から見るとフランスってディクションサポートが気候変動に対して営農ソーラーが果たせる役割何なのかと、そういったことで非常に科学的な視点からですね、研究をずっと積み重ねてきているというふうな印象を持ってます。で、毎年国際会議に出席するためにそういう思いが強まってるんですが、僕の目から見ると日本はどっちかっていうとですね、経験主義というか、あまり研究がなかなかそんなに興味を持ってソーラーシェアリングの研究をやってるような学生さんも少ないし、そういったことが非常に弱いなっていうのをいつも感じてるんですけども、なぜその研究が大切なんでしょうかね。そういった研究することによってどういった社会的な効果とか、そういったのがあるんでしょうか。
Oh, yes. Is it working? Yeah. I really think we miss Japanese publications. We need more Japanese publication about what you do in agrivoltaics, because it took us so much time to discover what you are doing. I was just frightened. Why don't they say that before? So yes, I think we should collaborate on publication because that's very, very, very important. Yes, in France, we are very concerned about climate change, and agrivoltaics is really in the line of mitigating, of adapting to climate change. So I'm not sure it's true the same way in Japan. We need to learn more about that. But if you are interested in collaboration on the control of constraints for plants with panels, we are really interested to go into this kind of collaboration. It's not that easy. I give you an example. We have been doing a lot of experiments to see if trees or panels could help us to improve the yield of crops in dry years. So we have built the devices to keep out the rain on some parts of the plot and see if under the panels the crop would grow better or resist better and so and so. Each year we do that, we have a very heavy rainy season. And we don't succeed to control the rain on the plot. So that's not so easy to do it experimentally, to prove it, to publish it, to convince people. So we need collaboration on that, and that would be very interesting to do it together. Another point that is very concerning for us in Europe and in France in particular, at the moment, we have 1 million hectares of cropland in France that produces food that is burnt into the motors of our cars, okay? So if you compare the efficiency of a combustion engine, a thermal car, driven by ethanol or DSR from crops, and an electric car that is driven by electricity by a PV system, there is no comparison. You can drive a car 20,000 kilometers with 1 hectare of wheat, and we can drive a car 1 million kilometers with 1 hectare of PV panels. So there is no way to do that any longer. And it's the decision that's coming in France and probably in Europe to go down on agro fuels, fuels from that. But there is still a requirement for those fuels for planes, for flights, because that's very difficult to go on electric planes, and for maybe lorries, trucks, and so on. So there will still be a need for that, but for cars, that should disappear. And so this kind of discussion is very strong at the moment. I don't think you have such crops in Japan, but if you have some, very open to discuss about collaboration on that too.
Christian? Yeah, let's go to the next. Sasha? NEXT さんと、それからルクサージャパンというところと我々協力をして、日本に垂直ソーラーを入れたんですね。私たちがこれ入れたいと思ったのは、やはり日本だけじゃなくて、海外でもたくさんいい技術、そういったものが生まれていく中で、オープンイノベーションを共に起こしていきたいと。だから非常にチャレンジングだとは思ったんですが、一緒にやったんですけれども、NEXT さんとしては、ドイツ国内以外にもいろんなところで今プロジェクトを始められていると思うんですが、どうして海外にも展開しているのか、でどういった国でやられているのか、少し聞かせてください。
Yeah, I think we see a huge potential for the vertical technology. I think the strongest argument is, of course, on the agricultural side, and that's the one which matters. We have a lot of space in between, and we need this space. And it's also, let's say, some sort of symbiosis with the electric part. Yeah, since the other way around is also true. We need to have the space in between. For avoiding shadowing to the modules, but this one is still usable for agricultural purposes. Yeah? So you can also take it the other way around and can say, agrivoltaics enable us to have these grid supportive systems which enlarge the energy production, widens the energy production. And I think this makes a lot of sense, really, to use it, all around the world. I think we saw the map, but also, let's say, maybe near to the equator is not the best for us, but there are many potential applications. We wanted to see the system, and we are quite happy about all companies and scientific institutions who cooperate with us, and to also check this technology out in their countries and see the results and enforce the installation. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. カイ、いつもですね、僕はやっぱりアメリカっていうのは非常に研究でもすごい進んでいると。特に営農ソーラーに関しては、アリゾナ大学とコロラド大学がもう古くから研究されていて、アリゾナの方は乾燥ですよね。ドライランドにおける、水利用中心の研究が多くて、で、コロラド大学は、放牧、特に羊とかヤギの放牧ですね。そういったことに非常に強いというふうに、で、それ長年やられていると。で、そういったことがベースになって、今回、ソーラーファームサミットがこの前行われて、だんだん、関心が非常に高まっている時だと思うんですね。で、コロラドには、コロラド、営農ソーラー学習センター、コロラドアグリボイタイクスラーニングセンターっていうのも設立されました。そういった研究とかですね、教育に非常に力を入れているという印象があるんですけれども、そういった、なぜそんなに研究とか教育が必要だと思われますか？そういったことがどういった影響があると思いますか？
Yeah, thank you, Makoto. I would even like to back up and think about everything that my fellow presenters just said, talking about the value of what we can learn from Japan, for instance. And the Agrivoltaic Learning Center is an example of communicating the science in a different way that I think is very important. And for instance, in Japan, if we can't access peer-reviewed publications, I think it's still tremendous value held in the farmers and practitioners that have been practicing agrivoltaics. And we don't necessarily need to learn only through publication from them, but by speaking to them and sharing that knowledge more broadly or directly through projects like the Agrivoltaic Learning Center in Colorado. And as you said, we are facing issues with water, drought, heat, and in many ways, particularly in Arizona, Colorado, and the Southwest, we like to think of our region as a snapshot of the future that much of the world will look like under climate change. For instance, in France, they're beginning to experience drought and heat, but in Arizona, those are the conditions that we have been living with for years. So our research has the ability to inform future scenarios elsewhere where we'll experience more heat, more drought, and we might be able to test the benefits of agrivoltaics in a future scenario today. And of course, finally, in the US, we have the same issues where we have peak production during the center of the day, and we need to better balance our grids. And all the benefits that Sasha talked about are equally applicable in much of the US, even if, we're cut out of some of that map. It's still important to be able to balance and have an efficient grid that's resilient, and PV plays an important role, and we know the benefits that agrivoltaics is going to share. I think most of all, our research in the US has the ability to show agrivoltaics in these extreme environments, like a future projection of climate change, but across varying environments. And it's it's very different. We don't have these regulations right now. And I think it's so important that we do open up to alternative means of knowledge, because if we wait for the publications to inform agrivoltaics, the US is going to be developed before we have the knowledge we need. And I think these collaborative efforts can help us catch up in a way without making too many mistakes.
ということは、我々先行しているんで、たくさん失敗をしてきているということをよく分かってらっしゃるだと思うんですけれども、ですね、せっかくなんでもうあと数分しかないんですけれども、フロアに来ている海外のゲストの方で、これだけ言っておきたいということがあれば、いくつかお聞きしたいと思います。Okay, open to floors, particularly guests from abroad. If you have any comments, if you want to express, we have a few minutes. So, anybody? Stefan?
貴重なご講演ありがとうございました。私、福島大学の食農学類の金子と申します。皆さん昨日多分行かれた千葉の匝瑳の東さんと一緒に、耕さない農業の研究をやっております。いくつか質問あるんですけど、時間がないので一つだけ限らせていただきますが、今日、肥沃な土地と、そうでない土地に PV を作るというような話があったと思うんですが、遮光率のような、いかに太陽光を地面と、発電で分けるかっていうのを考えたときに、肥沃な土地の方が、PV 作った方がいいのか、あるいは肥沃でない土地に作った方がいいのか、その先は、不毛な土地ですね。砂漠にやった方がいいのかっていうのを、考える必要あると思うんですけども、考えるにあたって、どういうような基準をお考えでしょうか。何かクライテリアがあれば教えていただきたいと思います。
はい。すごいヘビーな質問が来ました。皆さんに聞いてると1時間あっても足りないんで、誰か一人、1分でコメントお願いします。Any of you? Question?
It depends really of your country. In France, we have no desert. We have no wasted land, or very few. We have some, of course, but we use them to build construction for housing mainly. When you have such a limited land availability, I think agrivoltaics is the ultimate solution. But you need to keep the crop yield, because that's really the key of the system. To me, electricity is the cherry on the cake. It's something that is added to the crop production. I am a crop modeler, and when you are a crop modeler, you learn that crops use about a third of the sun radiation throughout the year. So 2/3 are not used by the crops. So we need to find smart ways to harvest these 2/3 without diminishing too much the crop production. So we have no choice. In the US, they have a lot of desert, so it's another story.
Thank you. もう一人、ステファン手挙げてたんですね。ステファン。
Hello. Yes, I think now it's working. Thank you very much for the presentation. Yeah, let me allow two comments on the research and development aspect. Having been a researcher myself, I'm, for who don't know me, I'm Stefan. I work for German solar project developer BayWa Renewable Energy, and the R&D. We try to improve the technology, better quality to lower price. So really, it's focusing on technology push. We want to improve the technologies. However, in my opinion, R&D only makes sense if there is the window of opportunity in future. We are innovative, so we can build in future also projects. The purpose, this we call demand pull. So it should go technology push, R&D hand in hand with demand pull market development. But on the regulative side for AKPV, this is also where innovation should take place. And the policy learning, policy adaptation is far too slow. I think what we have seen that science, public institution, yeah, like I think on the panel there's only one industry and 4 researchers. Great, it's public institutions. But most R&D takes place in industry. This is true in medicine, this is true in farming, this is true also in solar. So most R&D comes from industry. And if you want to attract investment into R&D from industry, you have to show us there is a market. There is a market development. Without a market, no R&D from industry. Then this will always be a public thing, it will be a niche, and it will never be developed. So most important, I think, in my opinion, is demand pull, not technology push at that stage. And I'm happy to get your feedback, what your opinion is on here. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Any comment? Yeah.
Thanks, Stefan, for your comment. Can you hear me? It has to go hand in hand, I agree. I would not go to this point where to say the one is more important to the other, because the regulatory framework determines what comes out in the market research and market development of companies. So what we have seen in China, for example, is that there was a very vague regulatory framework, and facilities we see on a large scale are more or less ground-mounted systems a bit elevated. So the way we shape our legal framework is decisive for this kind of agrivoltaic systems and the synergies we attract out of them. So also here, just already ignoring the research part, but only this interplay with regulatory framework and companies development, you can't connect it. So I also would not say one is more important to the other. What I would stress here is that the difference we already mentioned, that out of these market developments, we can learn so much from science side, and the other way around, from science side, we can learn a lot of interesting approaches for technology. I think that's the way to go. And maybe also comment to Christian. Also here, I would not say agrivoltaics is somehow more relevant than other PV developments, because first of all, as you said by yourself, it's so diverse on a global scale, but also on a national scale. There are so many challenges we are facing apart from agriculture, which are as important. For example, biodiversity measures. And also here, photovoltaics can create large benefits for creating new habitats, flora, fauna, improving wildlife. That we should also here not get this attempt, or we should resist the attempt to say the one is more important than the other. I think that's the main lesson I learned from my years on research on integrated PV. Sasha.
Thank you, Max. And yeah, Sasha want to say something. Yeah.
Hello? Yeah, okay, now it works, sorry. Yeah, I think we might explain why we are talking so much about regulation. And I fully agree with you, Christian. You said agriculture is the first point, and the electricity production is only an add-on. But if we are looking on the economics, it's exactly the opposite. And so the huge our main aim must be to find a regulation which protects the agriculture from too much PV. Yeah, that's the case, since whenever it is possible and whenever agrivoltaics get, let's say, special permits or whatsoever advantages in development, everybody will try to, let's say, install conventional cheap PV and leaving no space for agriculture. And that, I think, is the key we need to know. And that's the reason why we really need good and strong regulation. We need clear measurement and enforcement, and also in sanctioning to assure that, on agricultural ground, we see only agrivoltaics. That's the thing.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Sasha. このすごい続けたんですけれども、時間がありません。で、でも、私たちやってきてですね、いろいろな今、プラットフォームができていて、恒常的に学べるような場とか、セミナーとか、例えばアイドとかありますんで、そういうところでまた必要に応じて、 こういった議論ができればと思います。我々からのお願いですけれども、日本はですね、東アジアいっぱいそうなんですけど、やはり、母国語でないとなかなかできない。英語での議論がガーッと進んでると、やっぱりどうしても、閉鎖的になってしまうんで、たまにはですね、通訳を入れたような、そういった会を設けてもらえれば、もっと多様な意見を入れられると思うんで、そういった機会を設けてやれたらなというふうに思います。で、今日はちょっと時間が足りなくなってしまって、最初から見えてたんですけれども、尻切れをトンボ的に終わってしまいますけれども、また次の機会があるということに期待して、これで終わりにしたいと思います。では、最後に、ソーラーシェアリング推進連共同代表、もう一人の共同代表であられる西さんの方から、理解の言葉をいただきます。
はい、皆さんこんにちは。ただいまご紹介いただきました、一般社団法人ソーラーシェアリング推進連盟、共同代表理事の西と申します。今日はですね、国内外から、こういったオンライン、それからオフラインで、本当に多くの皆様にご参加いただきましてありがとうございました。それからですね、8団体からなる運営の皆様、事前のアレンジメント、それから当日の運営含めて本当にお疲れ様でした。私も今日の皆様の発表、それから今のトークセッションをお伺い、拝聴してですね、現在の状況、それから我々日本でもですね、今後やっていかなきゃいけないということが非常に明確になったかなというふうに思いました。日本ではご存知の方もいらっしゃるかもしれませんが、ちょうど10年前にですね、農地の上でこのソーラーシェアリングを設置することができるようになりました。そして現在は推計ですが約3000箇所ほどのこのソーラーシェアリングが日本全国に設置をされています。で、その中でもですね、いろんな設備の設計だったり、いろんな農作物、それから事業の座組もですね、様々なものがあるんですけれども、その中で我々ソーラーシェアリング推進連盟としては、まずはこの自然との調和、それからコミュニティパワーの三原則、これを大切にしてですね、2030年までに日本の農地の1% にソーラーシェアリングを設置して、日本国内の電力使用量のまずは4% を賄っていこうと。それから2050年には日本の農地の 5% にソーラーシェアリングを設置して、日本の電力量の約 20% ですね、賄っていこうと。そうすることによって、農業のリニューアブルエナジー 100% を目指していきたいと、そういった思いで日々活動の方をさせていただいております。こうして地域の中で食料とエネルギーを自給を高めていく、そうすることによってですね、農業も含めて化石燃料に頼らない地域を作っていく。これらを次世代、さらにはその次の世代にですね、残していく、そういう仕組み作りをですね、していきたいというふうに思っております。その仕組みを、本日のように、世界各国の皆様と議論をして、さらにそれを世界各国に導入をしていく。そうすることによって、貧困だったり、争いのない平和な世界を作っていく。そういうところをですね、目指しております。そうすることが、このソーラーシェアリングを発明した長島明先生の思いに応えることになっていくんだと信じております。この国際会議ですが、来年はアメリカで開催されると伺っております。ぜひですね、将来的には日本でも開催をしていきたいなと思っておりますので、各国の皆様ご調整の上ですね、ぜひ前向きにご検討いただければと思います。我々も、誠意、準備の方を進めていきたいと思っております。明日も、残り1日、この会議続くというふうにお伺いしております。移動もですね、多くあって皆様、お疲れと思いますので、本日は、しっかり、お休みになってですね、明日も実りのある会議にしていただければと思っております。本当にお疲れ様でした。以上をもちまして、私からの閉会の挨拶とさせ せていただきます。本日はどうも皆様ありがとうございました。
最後にちょっとご紹介が明日も、フォーラムいくつかあります。で、皆さんがご参加いただける、それもまたハイブリッド形式で同時通訳が入っているイベントが2つあるんですけれども、国会エネルギー調査会準備会の第3回営農ソーラー国際公開シンポジウムということで、政策課題に絞ったセミナーを明日執り行います。16時から10時45分です。詳しくはICEP のホームページに掲載してありますので、ご興味ある方はまたご参加ください。現場でも参加できますが、オンライン参加の方が簡単だと思いますので、よろしくお願いします。それでは、長時間にわたりましてありがとうございました。未消化の議論の部分は今後に引き継いでいきたいと思いますので、また関心を持ってご参加いただければと思います。本日はどうもありがとうございました。